Hello, today I'd like to talk about terror and horror, and I'm very bad at defining things, so allow me to just read some stuff off Wikipedia. Terror is usually described as the feeling of dread and anticipation that precedes the horrifying experience. By contrast, horror is the feeling of revulsion that usually occurs after something frightening is seen, heard, or otherwise experienced. It is the feeling one gets after coming to an awful realization or experiencing a deeply unpleasant occurrence. In other words, horror is more related to being shocked or scared, and then parentheses being horrified, while terror is more related to being anxious or fearful. And then Stephen King adds on the notion of revulsion, and let me read that part. So this is from Dance Macabre, and he talks, or Dance Macabre, I always screw that one up. I don't know, anyway. But basically, Stephen King says that terror is the finest element, and that's what he tries to create. And then horror is when you see the creature, and that has the shock value, and then revulsion is sort of the gag reflex, the gimmick. And then he said that this is his good quote. I recognize terror as the finest emotion, and so I will try to terrorize the reader. But if I find I cannot terrify, I will try to horrify, and if I find that I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out, aka the revulsion. I'm not proud. So it's interesting to see Stephen King sort of analyze his own work and say, he just does whatever it takes, and certainly I think that's a decent commitment to creating something that people will like. But I think it's better to take a step back and try and analyze creating horror versus terror and also revulsion. And it's something I've thought about a lot. Firstly, in looking at revulsion, is that an emotion that works well in the context of horror? And I think that it does. I think things that are really gross do sort of amplify the horror experience, and I'm not 100% sure why. I mean. I don't know. I wish I had sort of a better answer for why that is a component in horror movies and horror games and everything. But I mean, if you look at it, I think it's sort of a very common element. I mean, the whole sort of genre of torture porn. I mean, certainly the first Saw was quite clever, and I thought this first Saw was good, but then it sort of went off into this new genre of torture porn where it's just like this gross out violence and crazy stuff. And I mean, I don't think that was the beginning of it. I mean, if you look at like the original Hellraiser or like the writings of Clive Barker, I think he tries to explore sort of that visceral, gross, disgusting aspect of it. And I think, having these gross, disgusting monsters sort of amplifies the revulsion you fear, and sort of that ties into the philosophy of horror book I always refer to, and they talk about, the villain in horror needs to be, unclean, impure, horrifying, gross, disgusting, wrong, just like some sort of monster. And so I think the revulsion ties well into your sort of villain design. But I mean, as far as just gross out gore is concerned, I mean, it does seem like it appeals to some people, and I'm not 100% sure why. But I mean, it's a good way to get a reaction out of people. I mean, you look at the Outlast whistleblower DLC, and even some stuff in Outlast where you're just like, ugh. And I mean, I think it works, towards the atmosphere. But I mean, obviously, I don't think anyone's like, yeah, I want to see this movie because it's gross. Well, I guess that was why I saw the Human Centipede. I was talking to some guys at Sony because we were down there for Fantastic Arcade, and we were showing like some PlayStation 3 games like Retrograde, and they're all like, "Oh man, Human Centipede, it's so gross, it's so gross. So you got to see it, it's so gross." And I'm like, "Yes, I got to see it." I mean, I guess some people like myself do see a movie just because it's so gross, but I guess probably I should have started with the distinction of horror and terror. And I think there's sort of a fine line between the two, and I don't know if there's a way to have horror without any, or sorry, terror without any horror, because terror, as defined by Wikipedia, is basically the anticipation that precedes the horrifying experience. If there is no horrifying experience, is it possible to maintain the terror? And I think probably it's possible. I mean, if you look at, I think, like The Raven or something. I hope I'm not misremembering The Raven, but I mean, you know, the guy just sort of goes crazy from the tension, or I mean, that seems like the work in the way it works in a lot of Poe stories is just, you know, there's nothing horrifying. It's just, you know, internally, you know, there's this build up, this anticipation, this fear, anxiety, and then the person breaks, you know, telltale heart, etc. So, but I mean, in a video game, I think it'd be a lot harder. And certainly I think, you know, there's different types of horror for video games, and certainly, you know, jump scare is the shocking thing, which is the horror, whereas terror is more the atmosphere. And certainly, I think, you know, with Neverending Nightmares, we're really going to create the atmosphere, the terror, more so than the horror. And I mean, I think maybe the terror is harder, and obviously you can be the judge of whether we succeed or not. But to me, like, the atmosphere is really more important, because that feeling of anxiety is what I'm trying to capture in terms of obsessive compulsive disorder and you know, my struggles with mental illness. You know, certainly OCD is an anxiety disorder, and so I've had crippling anxiety and panic attacks and things. So that's what I'm trying to capture, and that's what's most appealing to me. And certainly my favorite horror games, like something like Silent Hill, you know, there's a lot of that, and Fatal Frame, you know, there's some great jump scares, but I think, you know, just exploring that mansion, and you could be attacked at any time, you know, that's really tense. And so I think that's sort of my favorite aspects of horror. But, well, I guess I can't use horror in that sense of scary video games, because the horror, of course, is the enemy stuff. Now I'm getting confused. But anyway, back to what I was trying to say, ignoring my use of horror as a genre versus horror as in this distinction that Wikipedia and Stephen King make. I think you do need sort of a payoff, and I think, you know, with the Kickstarter demo level, you know, there was a few jump scares, but there were no enemies. There was no threat, and I think, you know, had we had no threats throughout the duration of the game, I think we would sort of lose that atmosphere. I think the idea, you know, is you have to fear what's lurking around every corner, and you know, in video games, you have to have things lurking around the corner, and you know, because we can't control the player's actions, you know, they have to have negative repercussions, right? Because if, you know, the enemy is this terrible, you know, monster, but the player can walk up to them and start, you know, tapping him on the nose with a crowbar or something, then it doesn't matter, you know, how scary his animation was. the player will find no threat. Whereas in a movie, you can just have the people run from your monster, the same monster, and you can make the people very scared, and the monster doesn't even ever have to kill someone. You don't necessarily need a body count. But I think to keep the tension in the video games, to keep the, rather, terror in the video games, because certainly terror is analogous to the tension, you do need that sort of threat, that menace and the punishment for, messing up. Now, in Neverending Nightmares, we've sort of done an interesting thing where the punishment is not very severe, probably the least severe out of any horror video game. I mean, certainly, Amnesia and Amnesia Machine for Pigs, weren't overly challenging, and in like a Machine for Pigs, you woke up in some random place, very close to where you were killed by the enemy, and that's kind of similar to Neverending Nightmares, although I didn't quite feel like it fit in the context of the narrative, like, why are you in some random cage in a Machine for Pigs, whereas in Neverending Nightmares, it is the narrative. The narrative is you keep waking up into these terrible nightmares, so I feel like, to some extent, we can keep the tension up and or the terror up, and that's sort of working in our favor. But yeah, I think, again, sort of I'm trying to, as I think about, future games and ways to improve Neverending Nightmares, I am trying to understand the genre and sort of the tools, because I don't quite feel like I have a toolbox of tricks, and I pull them out. Whereas when approaching a lot of game design things, you do like, oh, I had a boss who had the little pseudocode equation, while not fun, particles plus plus, which honestly works quite well in a number of situations. You'd be surprised just how much fun visual polish can create, and so that's a great sort of trick to have in your toolbox. But for horror games, it's like, I guess, is jump scare a trick? Maybe, but like, you can only use them like once or twice, and then then it's just like, oh, this is dumb, this is annoying, this keeps happening, and you gotta come up with good ones, like, books falling off shelves and stuff. It's like, been done before. And I mean, certainly you can, do a, sharp change in the music, and we do some interesting things with the music and the sound design, but I do feel like you have to be creative, and you have to keep coming up with sort of new ways to surprise the player, and new ways to sort of create the tension by these horror-inducing enemies that can hurt the player. I don't know. Anyway, it ended up being probably a little more rambly than I wanted. More of an academic discussion of terror, horror, and revulsion, but I don't know, that's what I think at this moment in time, and certainly, it'll be interesting to see how people are receiving Neverending Nightmares, and how I might sort of change my approach. Do we have too many enemies? Do we have not enough enemies? And that's a question that I've asked myself many, many, many times, and I haven't really quite come to a good conclusion on that, but we'll see, and certainly we can add or remove enemies before our final release date, but I think to some extent, we won't know for sure until we have a finished product. Anyway, thanks for watching.